6 weeks after my father told me privately he planned to name me CEO of the company he built, my brother-in-law filed an anonymous ethics complaint accusing me of fraud, built from details only someone with access to my calendar could have known. My name is Wilhelmina Bishop, and before this happened, I believed I understood the people I trusted and the life I had built. The HR director asked to meet with me privately before the Monday morning executive meeting, and when I stepped into her office, I could tell from the way she did not offer the usual small talk that something had already gone beyond routine. Her blinds were half closed against the sharp white light that came through the west windows, and there was a thin stack of papers on her desk with a yellow sticky note on top. She waited until I had taken the chair opposite her before she picked up the stack, aligned the corners with 2 neat taps against the desk, and slid the top page toward me. It was a printed complaint from our company ethics hotline. Anonymous, alleging that I had been falsifying expense reports, using company funds for personal travel, and creating a hostile work environment for junior staff. I read the first paragraph once, then twice, the words not sinking in immediately because they were so obviously calculated to sound more severe than they were. The complaint listed dates, it listed dollar amounts. It referenced an off-site meeting in Chicago, a dinner in Hartford, a car service in Newark, a hotel upgrade, and even a flight change that had been approved by our travel office after a supplier meeting moved by 6 hours. The author had gotten enough detail right to make the allegations sound specific, but not enough to suggest they understood the actual context of any of it. By the time I reached the second page, I already knew 2 things. First, whoever had written it had real access to my calendar and my expense history. Second, my brother-in-law Cassius was the only person in the company who fit that description and had a reason to weaponize it. My name is Wilhelmina Bishop, and I was 38 years old at the time this happened. I was Chief Operating Officer of Bishop Manufacturing, a precision parts company my father founded 31 years earlier in a leased warehouse with 3 machines, a loan from his older brother, and enough stubbornness to outlast every supplier who told him he would fail. I had worked there for 14 years. I started in operations, moved through production planning, took over procurement, then logistics, then plant coordination, and eventually became COO 6 years before this complaint landed on HR's desk. My father, Augustin Bishop, had built the company from nothing. He was not a sentimental man in business, though he was a deeply sentimental man everywhere else. He believed in order, in directness, in seeing a thing with your own eyes before you decided what it was. He had also always said that if a family member was going to work in the company, that person would have to be better than everyone else in the room because family could not afford to look entitled. That principle had shaped my entire career. It also shaped the mistake that almost cost me my position. My sister Delphine married Cassius Okonkwo 9 years ago. Cassius was polished, articulate, and good at reading a room fast enough to make himself look like the natural center of it. He had a confident smile, a tailored wardrobe, and a way of speaking that made him sound like he was always just a little ahead of the conversation. At family dinners, he was the one who remembered everyone's birthdays, asked after people's parents, and made small compliments sound thoughtful enough to be real. My father liked him from the start. Not because Cassius was flashy. My father distrusted flash. He liked Cassius because he was ambitious in a way that seemed disciplined, and because Cassius looked like a man who could sell a factory floor to a skeptical buyer if he had enough time and the right numbers in front of him. 5 years ago, my father brought Cassius into the company as vice president of sales. At the time, I supported the hire. I truly did. The company had grown beyond the point where my father could manage every relationship personally, and Cassius had worked for 2 smaller industrial distributors before joining us. He knew the market. He knew some of our customers. He could talk about margins and lead times without sounding like he had learned the words from a webinar. His first year was decent, his second was better, and by the third he had settled into the role of someone who produced acceptable numbers while quietly making himself feel indispensable. But he never had the same operational authority my father gave me. That was by design. I sat where I sat because I knew the plants, the vendor network, the labor dynamics, the board culture, and the ugly details that only show up when a company has to actually make things on time rather than simply promise them. Cassius knew I would eventually be the successor CEO, or at least, I had always assumed he knew. There was a lot of family history in the company, and not all of it was clean. My father had raised us to work, not to assume. Delphine had chosen a different path and built a career in education before she married Cassius. I had chosen the business. That choice meant something in our family. It meant long hours, weekends spent on procurement crises, holiday dinners interrupted by plant emergencies, and the expectation that I would not ask for special treatment just because I had the same last name as the man who signed payroll. So when HR asked me to sit down, my first thought was not that I had been accused of something absurd. My first thought was that someone was trying to move against me before my father's retirement announcement. I did not confront Cassius that morning. I did not storm into his office, wave the complaint in his face, or accuse him in front of anyone. People always imagine the failure of a betrayal is that it makes you angry. That is not the first thing it does. The first thing betrayal does, if it is smart, is make you careful. I sat across from the HR director, Janine Mercer, and kept my face still while she explained that the hotline submission had been reviewed because it named a senior executive and alleged possible misuse of funds and abuse of authority. Her tone was professional but not cold. She had that careful HR voice people use when they are trying to avoid sounding accusatory, while also making clear that the matter is real. "We're obligated to review this," she said. "Of course," I told her. She looked relieved that I wasn't offended by the existence of the complaint. That, more than anything, told me she already suspected it might be manufactured. Janine had been with the company long enough to know what a genuine grievance looked like. Those usually came messy, emotional, inconsistent, and specific in the wrong places. This one was too polished, too structured, too aware of how to sound serious. She asked whether I had any immediate explanation for the expense items listed. I read them carefully and told her the truth. They are either legitimate business costs or distortions of legitimate costs, I said. But I'm not going to speculate about the source until I understand the scope. That answer seemed to satisfy her. Or at least it seemed to tell her I understood the rules. She made copies of the complaint for the investigation file and advised me not to discuss it with anyone directly involved until I had legal counsel. She also said that because the ethics hotline was anonymous, they could not simply identify the submitter and hand over a name even if they had suspicions. The process would need to be handled through formal channels. I left her office with the complaint in a plain manila folder and my pulse pounding in my ears. The executive meeting was in 40 minutes. I went to my office, shut the door, and sat in the silence long enough to feel the anger arrive behind the shock. There are certain kinds of anger that make you want to throw something. This was not one of them. This was a colder thing. A more exact thing. It felt like stepping onto a familiar factory floor and realizing one machine had been rewired by someone who knew the wiring diagram well enough to hide what they'd done. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was an error introduced by someone who expected it to survive scrutiny because everyone around it had too much else to do. I called Priscilla Nakamura before lunch. Priscilla was an employment attorney with a reputation for being polite in the way a scalpel is polite. Precise, clean, and not interested in your feelings if they interfered with the work. I had met her years earlier when we were drafting a compensation policy for senior leadership. I trusted her because she did not flatter me, and because she had once said in a meeting with my father, "A family business is still a business, and if it acts otherwise, it's already in trouble." She listened to me without interrupting, then said, "Do not confront anyone until we know what we're dealing with." That was my thought. Good. We need to treat this as both an internal investigation and a potential retaliation matter. Cooperate fully with HR. Preserve everything. Do not communicate about this over any channel you wouldn't be comfortable producing later. Whoever did this had my calendar and my expenses. Then someone with access did it, she said. That narrows the field, but not enough yet. I told her the one name I could not stop thinking about. She did not react. That was another reason I trusted her. She did not give me the satisfaction of being shocked on my behalf. We don't assume until we can prove, she said. But we can start from the practical reality that if this is retaliation, the timing matters. And the timing did matter. 6 weeks earlier, my father had told me, in his office after everyone had gone home, that he intended to retire within the year. He did not make announcements casually, so I knew immediately that this was not just planning, it was the beginning of a transition. He had also said, almost as an aside, that he intended to recommend me to the board as his successor. He said it as if it were obvious. My father was never warm in the ways other fathers on television are warm. He was not one for speeches about destiny or legacy. But that night he had looked tired in a way I had not seen before, and when he told me he wanted me to take the company, I had to sit still and let the meaning of it arrive all the way through me. Cassius could not have known that directly. Or at least, not yet. If he had learned it though, that would give him motive. Strong motive. I spent the next 4 days doing nothing but document review. Expense reports, travel records, calendar entries, vendor meeting notes, Email chains. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from proving your own ordinary behavior. You think of yourself as a person who simply lived a month, and then suddenly you are comparing line items against hotel receipts and looking back through every lunch you paid for with the company card, wondering how an outsider would make each one look suspicious if they wanted to. Every allegation in the complaint turned out to be a lie in one of three forms. Some were outright false, like the claim that I had charged a weekend resort stay to a supplier meeting that never happened. Some were half-truths, like the dinner in Hartford that had actually been a 3-hour working dinner with 2 plant managers and a regional customer, transformed by the complaint writer into a private luxury expense. Some were the kind of lies that only work because they are technically framed as questions. The complaint would say things like, Ms. Bishop appears to have used company funds for personal travel on more than one occasion, which sounds damning until you realize the travel was to inspect a late shipment at one site and then attend a board briefing at another, and the author knows exactly how to strip the context without technically asserting a fact they can be pinned to. That was what unsettled me most. This was not somebody guessing. This was somebody who understood how I worked and how to distort that work without crossing the obvious line into an easily disproven lie. I asked Priscilla to bring in a digital forensics consultant named Cornelius Achibi, a man she had used before when internal records mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. Cornelius was one of those people who seemed quiet because his mind was already moving faster than his mouth. He came in with a laptop, a legal pad, and no interest in corporate drama. He treated the whole thing like a crime scene, which in practical terms it was. The hotline provider kept security metadata for submissions even though the complaint itself remained anonymous to the receiving employer. Priscilla was able to request that data formally because the allegation was against a senior executive and could materially affect the company's governance. Cornelius examined the submission timestamp, routing data, and access record from the provider's logs. He called me and Priscilla into a conference room late on a Thursday afternoon. The complaint was submitted Sunday night at 11:47, he said. And the origin? I asked. He turned his laptop toward us and pointed to the routing result. It traces to an IP associated with Cassius Okonkwo's home internet connection. I stared at the screen for a long second without speaking. Priscilla didn't move either. Then she said, "That's not the same as proof in court, but it's enough to expand the investigation." Cornelius nodded. "It also lines up with something else." He pulled up the body of the complaint and showed us how the language had been assembled. The expense details matched records accessible to a senior executive with administrative privileges. The calendar references were specific enough that whoever wrote it likely had either direct access or screenshots copied from systems Cassius could reasonably have seen. The complaint was not just aiming at me, it was written from inside the knowledge structure of the company. "Can we tell whether someone could have accessed this through ordinary work channels?" I asked. "Some of it, yes," Cornelius said. "But the concentration of detail suggests somebody familiar with your schedule and records. Not a random employee. Not even a curious one." That was enough for me to say the next thing I already suspected. My father told the board 6 weeks ago he was planning to retire. Priscilla glanced at me. He told the board? Privately. In confidence. He said he intended to recommend me. She folded her hands. Who knew? Probably a handful of directors, maybe his lawyer, and anyone those directors confided in. Priscilla looked at Cornelius. Can we establish when Cassius learned it? That took another few days. The company backups, combined with standard security logs and a little patience, revealed an email chain that mattered far more than any single receipt. One of the board members, in what was probably meant as a casual comment during a dinner conversation, had mentioned the upcoming succession discussion to Cassius nearly 3 weeks before the ethics complaint was filed. That meant Cassius had time. Time to think, time to plan, time to make me look unstable, unethical, or both before my father could formalize anything with the board. The realization was so clean it almost made me nauseous. This was not a spur-of-the-moment act by a man offended by a minor slight. This was a move. My brother-in-law had decided to build a case against me, file it anonymously, and let the accusation land in the middle of a transition that would have put me in line to run the company our father built. He was betting that even if the complaint was never proven, the mere existence of it would create enough doubt to stall the succession and make him look like a safer, more neutral candidate for leadership. If the board got nervous, he would benefit. If my father hesitated, he would benefit. If I reacted badly, he would benefit even more. I thought about Delphine as soon as the shape of the thing became clear. That thought hurt in a different way. Delphine had never loved the company the way I did, but she had loved our family in a way that made her vulnerable to people who knew how to wear charm as armor. She had defended Cassius through little awkward moments at dinners, through comments from our aunts, through the occasional family irritation about how he always seemed to be networking even at Christmas. She had believed, as people often do about the person they married, that she knew the real man beneath the polished surface. And maybe she had. That was what made betrayal complicated. People are rarely one thing. Cassius could be loving to Delphine and still ruthless at work. He could remember her medication, help her through a bad week, and then sit down at a laptop on a Sunday night and try to destroy me. One version did not cancel the other. That was one of the worst lessons of adulthood, and one I had learned too many times. Priscilla advised me not to contact him. If he knows you suspect him, he can coordinate a defense, she said. We need to move through proper channels first. I hated that she was right. I hated even more that my instinct had been to storm into his office and demand an explanation. But by then I understood enough to know that emotional satisfaction would be expensive. So I did it the hard way. Priscilla drafted a formal response to HR, and I produced every supporting document the process required. We gave Janine Mercer the complaint itself, the expense reconciliations, the calendar logs, and a summary memorandum from Cornelius outlining the technical findings without overstating them. We also prepared a separate packet for the board's audit committee, because this was no longer just about my employment. It was about someone inside the company attempting to interfere with succession planning using a fabricated ethics complaint. That distinction mattered. If I went in as an offended daughter, the situation could be dismissed as a family dispute. If I went in with evidence of corporate misconduct, the board had a duty to take it seriously. Priscilla was very clear on that point. You want the process to protect you, she said, but more importantly, you want it to protect the company from anybody willing to manipulate it this way. That makes the issue bigger than family, which is exactly what it needs to be. Janine took the file to the ethics review panel. The audit committee requested a parallel review. Cassius was asked to provide a statement. I was not present for that conversation, but Janine later told me his answers were evasive from the first minute. He denied writing the complaint. He denied having access to the specific details cited in it. He denied knowing anything about my father's succession plans. And then, when pressed on the IP address, he said his home network was shared with visitors, maintenance workers, and a neighbor who used the Wi-Fi occasionally when the signal reached the driveway. Even Janine, who was trained to remain neutral, had the expression of a woman watching a man overestimate the room. The board's audit committee moved faster than I expected, but not because they rushed. They moved because the evidence was ugly in a way that made delay dangerous. A complaint like that, if allowed to linger unresolved, could poison the succession process even if it ultimately collapsed. The committee understood that, and for that I was grateful. My father asked to see me the afternoon before the committee made its preliminary determination. He was in his office with the blinds open, late sunlight on the edge of his desk, when I walked in carrying the full file. He looked older than he had 6 weeks earlier. Not dramatically older. Just enough that I noticed. He still had the same square shoulders and the same habit of standing to greet me. But there was fatigue in the motion. "Sit down," he said. I did. For nearly 2 hours I walked him through everything. The complaint, the specific distortions, the metadata, the timing. The email showing Cassius had learned about the succession plan before the complaint was filed. The evidence had a hard effect on him. Not dramatic, not theatrical. My father was not the kind of man who cursed or shouted much. He took in bad news by becoming still, and the stillness told you everything. As I spoke, his expression settled into the kind of look he wore on the factory floor when a machine had gone out of tolerance, and he was deciding whether to repair or replace. When I finished, he sat back and laced his hands together. "He did this to you," he said. It was not a question. Yes. He stared at the desk for a few seconds, then asked, "Did Delphine know?" "I don't know." His jaw tightened. I never should have put him in the company. That admission surprised me more than I expected. My father rarely said he regretted anything. He believed decisions were either correct at the time or not, and sentiment was a poor substitute for review. "I don't think the mistake was hiring him," I said. "I think the mistake was trusting any family member without the same controls you'd use for a non-family executive." He looked up at me then, and I could tell he understood exactly what I meant. My father had always believed family loyalty was a safeguard. I think, that day, he began to understand that family proximity can also be a vulnerability, if the structure around it is too loose. He asked me if I wanted to tell Delphine before the board acted. I said yes. I did not want my sister to hear the story from a committee memo, or from Cassius trying to wriggle free of responsibility. I wanted to tell her myself. So I met her 2 days later at her apartment. She opened the door in socks and an oversized sweater, with her hair pulled back in the kind of quick knot that told me she had been grading papers before I arrived. Delphine had always had a softer energy than I did, but she was not soft in the sense of fragile. She was soft in the sense that she paid attention to people's moods and carried them with her. That made hard truths harder for her than they were for me. She could tell immediately that something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked, before I was even fully inside. I told her the complaint had been filed, that it was anonymous, and that it accused me of expense fraud and creating a hostile environment. Her first reaction was disbelief. Then she laughed once, sharply, because the idea was so absurd it didn't fit in the room. "That's ridiculous," she said. I handed her the file. She looked at the first few pages and frowned, but I could see the moment the tone shifted for her. She knew enough about the company to recognize the details. She knew our travel patterns, the names of my assistants, the way meeting schedules could move under supplier pressure. The complaint was written with the kind of detail that makes something sound true if you aren't the person living it. "Who would do this?" she asked. I said her husband's name. For a second she just stared at me, as if waiting for the sentence to rearrange itself into something less devastating. "No," she said quietly. "Delphine." She sat down very slowly on the edge of the couch and put the papers in her lap, but she wasn't reading them anymore. Why would he do that? I told her what the timing suggested. I told her about Dad's retirement plans. I told her about the IP address. I told her about the email. And then I stopped talking, because there are moments when facts stop helping and only become objects somebody has to carry. She did not cry right away. Delphine's silence was worse than tears. She kept looking back and forth between the pages, as if maybe the information would confess to being mistaken if she stared hard enough. "He wouldn't," she said at last, but it sounded more like a plea than an argument. "I wouldn't be saying it if I didn't believe the evidence." She closed her eyes. "I need time. Take all the time you need." I left the file with her. That was the hardest thing I had done so far, because it felt like handing her a live wire and asking her to decide whether she trusted the current. The next month was one of the strangest of my professional life. At work, everyone could feel that something was happening, though no one was told the details. People always think secrecy prevents rumors. It doesn't. It only changes their shape. Departments went quiet when I entered rooms. A few executives became overly polite. A few others became careful in the way people are careful around a person they think may be falling from grace. I understood the look because I had seen it on other people's faces over the years. I kept doing my job. That was the only thing I could do. Orders still had to ship. Plants still had staffing problems. A major buyer in Ohio threatened to move a contract over a delay that had nothing to do with me, but everything to do with a missed die replacement. A warehouse manager in Indiana called twice in one day, because a supplier's part tolerance was drifting outside spec. My calendar stayed full, and every meeting felt a little unreal because I was sitting in those rooms knowing there was an internal file somewhere, questioning whether I had been abusing company funds and mistreating staff. I answered every HR question. I produced every receipt. I signed every release required. I did not talk to Cassius. At the office, he remained outwardly calm. That was perhaps the most infuriating part. He still attended meetings. He still spoke to people like someone who had done nothing unusual. He even made eye contact with me in the hallway one morning and offered a brief nod, the kind of neutral professional acknowledgement that would have looked innocent to anyone who didn't know what sat behind it. I came close to losing my temper only once, in a budget review meeting where he spent 10 minutes asking a plant manager questions he didn't need answered, and then tried to redirect the conversation to sales forecasts as if he were trying to remind everyone that he belonged in every discussion. I watched him talk and thought with almost scientific detachment that he had the nerve to keep acting like a legitimate executive while a fabricated complaint bearing his fingerprints was under review. Priscilla kept me grounded. "Do not assume the process is over until it is actually over," she told me, "and do not do anything that gives him a story about retaliation." I wanted to retort that I was not interested in his story, but the problem with a man like Cassius is that he does not need the truth, he only needs ambiguity. The board's audit committee finished its work within a month. Their conclusion was blunt enough to make even my father exhale when he read it. The complaint had been fabricated, submitted in bad faith, and timed to interfere with a succession process that Cassius knew was under discussion before the filing. The committee recommended termination for cause. The board voted unanimously. I was in a conference room when Janine called to tell me the decision had been finalized. For a second I couldn't speak, not because I was surprised, Because for so long I had been braced against the possibility that evidence might not matter as much as politics, or family discomfort, or the board's desire to avoid a public conflict. When the decision came back clean, I felt the tension leave my body in a wave so sharp I had to put a hand on the table. My father came to see me after the vote. He did not look relieved. He looked disappointed in a way that was almost physical. "It's done," he said. "Yes." He stood for a moment by the door, then crossed the room and put a hand briefly on my shoulder. "I'm sorry," he said. The apology startled me because I realized he was not apologizing for Cassius. He was apologizing for the fact that his decision to bring Cassius into the company had made this possible. "You didn't do this," I told him. "I chose badly. You chose based on the information you had." He gave me a look that said he knew I was being generous, maybe too generous, but I meant it. He had made a mistake. It was his to carry. That did not make him evil, it made him human, and my father had never liked being human in public. What came next was messy but controlled. Cassius was terminated. The company's statement was careful and brief. He was no longer employed, effective immediately, due to findings from an internal review. No one outside the leadership circle was given the full details. In a family business, even a justified termination becomes a weather system if you let it leak too far. Delphine took nearly 2 months to come back to me. She called first. Her voice sounded thin over the phone, like she had been crying recently or not sleeping much. "Can I come over?" When she arrived, she looked exhausted. Not just sad, though she was that too. She looked like someone who had spent a long time trying not to believe something, and had finally run out of places to put the effort. She sat in my kitchen with a mug she never drank from and said, "I asked him about it." I waited. He said the complaint was real, that maybe some of the details were wrong, but that there were still questions about how you handled travel and staff complaints. Then I asked him about the IP address. She took a breath and her hands tightened around the mug. He changed the subject. I said nothing. Then I asked him if he knew Dad was planning to name you as successor. Delphine looked up at me with a kind of pain that was nearly worse than anger. He said I was letting corporate politics poison my marriage. That was the moment, she told me, when the whole thing broke open for her. Not because he confessed. Because he didn't. He reached for the oldest manipulation in the world, making her doubt herself for asking questions. She spent another week digging through their own messages, their finances, the small private things couples accumulate when they are no longer being careful. I did not push. I did not ask for updates every day. I only told her that whatever she decided, I would support her. When she finally came back to my office, she did not look angry. She looked finished. "I believe you," she said. That was all. I stood up and crossed the room and held her while she cried for the first time since this started. There is no clean victory when someone in your family tries to destroy you. Even when the evidence wins, the family still loses something permanent. Trust does not regenerate just because a board memo says the truth has been established. Delphine and Cassius separated within the year. She told me later that the ethics complaint had not created the fractures in their marriage, only revealed how deep they already were. There had been resentment, she said, and quiet dishonesty, and a way of making her feel as if her questions were inconveniences rather than acts of care. I believed her. I had seen enough of Cassius to believe that he could be charming while withholding the truth. Charm is often just competence at selective exposure. The succession vote itself was delayed by the investigation, which was its own kind of victory for him even in defeat. He had wanted to create uncertainty, and he did. For a while I did not know if the board would push forward with me, or use the disruption as an excuse to choose someone less controversial. That word, controversial, was the one I hated most during those months, because it so often means the person who was harmed is now inconvenient. But the investigation cleared me, and the board had no real reason to pretend otherwise. Roughly 4 months after the original schedule, the vote went through, unanimous. When my father told me, I had to sit down because I could feel the room shift under the weight of it. I became CEO of Bishop Manufacturing 8 months after that Monday morning meeting with HR. 8 months sounds neat on paper. In reality, it was a grind of endless small humiliations, controlled anger, legal review, and the daily discipline of not letting someone else's lie make me behave in ways that supported it. There were mornings when I woke up already tired. There were nights when I lay awake going through every detail of the complaint again, wondering if there was some angle I had missed, some document buried in a server archive, some conversation I had forgotten that could somehow be twisted against me. Even after Cornelius found the metadata, even after the email chain, even after the board committee moved toward termination, I still had moments when I expected the floor to give way. That was the part nobody sees when they say someone was vindicated. Vindication is not a feeling. It is an administrative conclusion reached after a period of fear. My father transitioned into an advisory board role later that year. He never interfered with my decisions, which I appreciated more than I can say. He would ask questions, of course. My father loved questions. He believed they were proof someone was paying attention. But he did not hover. He did not try to keep one hand on the wheel. He seemed, in some ways, relieved to be able to step back and let the company become mine without having to pretend that succession had happened naturally and without pain. One evening, after most of the building had emptied, he came to my office and stood in the doorway looking at the nameplate on my desk. "You did good," he said. It was the kind of praise he gave sparingly. "I had help. You still did the work." That was true. Priscilla had been indispensable. Cornelius had been precise. Janine had followed procedure instead of letting the complaint float in ambiguity. But I had also had to endure the thing itself. I had to keep showing up while under suspicion. I had to keep thinking clearly while someone close to my family tried to make me look unfit for leadership. After the case resolved, Priscilla and I met for coffee in a lobby cafe downtown. She was not sentimental, and she did not usually linger after a matter was closed, but she sat with me that afternoon longer than I expected. "I want to tell you something," she said. I waited. People underestimate these cases when family is involved. They think a family business complaint is mostly emotional theater. It isn't. It's often exactly as serious as a non-family fraud case, just harder to handle because everyone is afraid of making the family dynamic worse. She stirred her coffee once and looked at me. "The reason this resolved is that you didn't let it become a private argument. You forced it into a structure that could examine evidence." I had thought about that many times already, but hearing it from her made it feel more concrete. If I had confronted him directly, I said, he would have had time to coordinate a story. "And maybe convince your sister he was being attacked," she said. "Exactly. You denied him the drama he needed." That sentence stayed with me. I have kept the original printed complaint in a drawer beside my CEO appointment letter. The two papers sit there like bookends. One marks the moment someone tried to define me by a lie. The other marks the moment the company, through evidence and process, refused to accept it. I do not keep the complaint because I enjoy revisiting the anger. I keep it because it reminds me how easily a smart, patient lie can become dangerous if the person targeted mistakes outrage for strategy. It reminds me that being right is not enough if you prove it in the wrong way. And it reminds me that power inside a family business is never just about titles or ownership or board votes. It is also about whether the people in the room are willing to let facts stay facts when the story becomes uncomfortable. Sometimes I open that drawer and look at the letterhead on my appointment letter, and think about the office I sit in now. It was my father's office once. The desk is his desk. The window faces the east lot, where delivery trucks still line up before sunrise. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the light comes in at an angle that turns the dust in the air gold for just a few minutes. I remember that light from childhood, from the days I would run through the building after school and find my father buried in paperwork, his sleeves rolled up, his glasses low on his nose. Back then, the office looked impossibly large. Now it just looks like a room that has witnessed a lot of decisions. There are days when I sit there and think less about Cassius than about the sequence of events that brought me to that chair. The complaint, the documents, the long, careful wait while HR and the board did their work. The way Delphine had to decide what kind of truth she could live with. The way my father had to admit he was wrong. The way I had to keep my composure in rooms where one careless word could have helped the lie survive. I do not think of that period as a triumph. I think of it as proof. Proof that the right process can still matter in a family full of feelings. Proof that a person can be tested by something deeply personal and still insist on evidence over impulse. Proof that sometimes the hardest thing is not fighting back immediately, but waiting until the truth has enough structure around it to stand. And if you are wondering what I learned from all of it, the answer is simple. Never underestimate the damage a jealous person can do when they think a shortcut will give them what they want. And never underestimate the value of making them face a process they cannot charm, bully, or shortcut their way through. That is how I kept my job. That is how I kept the company. And that is how the daughter of the man who built Bishop Manufacturing proved, under the harshest scrutiny of her career, that she belonged in his office.